finding that, like an NBC poll, finding that 57% of Americans say that government should do more to solve problems and meet the needs of Americans, which is a 20-year high. And Pew asked a different question. I'm reading here from Hot Air along the same lines. Do you prefer a bigger government that offers more services or a smaller one that offers fewer services? And the preference was for a bigger government offering more services, which is crazy. And that's why we're having a situation that we do where Congress is suddenly now balking at major tax reform, which is what we ought to do, and spending cuts, which we ought to make to accommodate the major tax reforms. But that's why you have the Republicrats appealing to the people who I don't think know any better, who are being polled by Pew. Judge Napolitano.
Hello, Jamie. How are you?
I know to you I may look old. Hope this statement ain't too bold, but here comes the judge.
Yes, indeed. And indeed, that Judge Napolitano, interesting Pew poll showing that Americans seem to prefer bigger government, which I find odd.
You know, good morning, Jamie.
Good morning
it's
to
always
you,
a pleasure to be with you. I am sorry to predict this, but I think the president is going to run into a problem with respect to these tax cuts, pardon me, not unlike the problem he ran into with his failed efforts so far to invalidate the Affordable Care Act, which we call Obamacare. And the problem with the tax cuts is this. There is a significant number in the Senate and in the House who do not want to add to the national debt, meaning if the government's going to continue to spend as it has been spending, in order to justify tax cuts, there have to be spending cuts. The president's view is, forget about it. We're going to cut taxes drastically. That's going to put people back to work. They're going to earn more money and pay more taxes, so we'll make up for it that way. That argument works on paper, but it never works in reality. So if enough Republicans in the Senate and enough Republicans in the House take the view that tax cuts have to be accompanied by spending cuts, there's not going to be any tax cuts because the president doesn't want to do that.
Yeah, that is interesting. I'm a little concerned about the fact that we have this idea of revenue neutrality, which to me is more of an excuse not to have to make hard decisions.
I agree with you, Jamie, I do. The problem is, well, this goes way back. I mean, it started with Woodrow Wilson, accelerated by FDR, compounded by LBJ, and then added to by every president since LBJ, Republican and Democrat. The government just spends so much more money in so many areas never authorized by the Constitution, and people and economic forces now are reliant upon that spending. It's unwise, it's unconstitutional, and it's harmful. But I don't think you can. Even I don't know that you can do it overnight. Undo it overnight.
They should have listened to Calvin Coolidge, Judge.
When he said,
well, 1924, Calvin Coolidge, in the first time ever when a president was both recorded audio and film, stood on the White House lawn, gave an address that was very impromptu, and said, sooner or later, folks, if you don't watch out, this is 1924, okay? This is 11 years after the federal income tax. He said, be careful, because the more you grow government, the more it's likely that we're going to be working a certain portion of our week solely for the government.
Oh, my goodness. That's up to about Wednesday afternoon by now.
Yeah, I know. I mean,
think about it. The government receives about $1.5 trillion a year in revenue, and it spends $2.5 trillion. Where does that other trillion come from? Well, borrowing. How's that borrowing paid back? By increased taxes in the future. I'll give you a horrific example. Woodrow Wilson borrowed $30 billion to fight World War I. I happen to think it was a useless, fruitless, destructive war that we had no business being involved in. I wasn't around at the time to voice that opinion. The $30 billion has never been repaid. We've just rolled it over. So we've paid back the original people from whom we borrowed it with additional borrowing. On that $30 billion, as of 2016, we've paid $15 billion in interest, and we still owe the $30 billion. That's the way the government operates.
Yeah.
No business or household could operate that way. As much as I am fond of many of the things President Trump wants to do, he will exacerbate that if he cuts taxes and doesn't cut spending. And your grandchildren will be working for the federal government until Thursday evening just to pay off to pay off the debt.
And you know what? It's so sad because Coolidge, by 1928, he had enough. And he's like, okay, I'm not doing this again. These people will never learn. And so he gave up, and in came Hoover, and the rest is history. So tell me.
Coolidge was one of the last of the presidents to veto legislation, even that which was popular, even that supported by his own party, because the Constitution didn't authorize it.
Oh, yeah.
Prior to that was Grover Cleveland. These guys are not considered great presidents by the people that make presidents great. But to me, a president who does that is great because he's putting a brake on a runaway Congress.
Absolutely. I mean, the problem is no one listened to him, and that was the issue. So
otherwise, such presidents haven't existed in your lifetime or mine or the lifetime of anybody listening to us right now, unless they are old enough to have remembered Calvin Coolidge.
Right. No doubt about it. All right. I know, too, you're hot on the trail of this Director Comey FBI story, the New York Times.
Oh, this has gotten very, very, very serious. I mean, it is wrong for the FBI to announce the existence of an investigation and its status. It's difficult for me to say this because of the respect I once had for Jim Comey and the disdain that I have had for many years for Hillary Clinton. So when he announced improperly, we are looking into a matter about her, not an investigation, a matter. The DOJ wouldn't let him use the word investigation. This resulted in his underlings calling him the director of the Federal Bureau of Matters rather than the Federal Bureau of Investigations, because they refused to call the matter involving Hillary what it was, a criminal investigation. But when he announced its existence and its termination, and then its reinstitution and its status, at the same time, the FBI was investigating the Trump campaign, about which he didn't say a peep. There is something to her argument that the FBI improperly injected itself into presidential politics in a way that hadn't happened since the days of J. Edgar Hoover. It's difficult for me to say that. I led the charge against her last fall, arguing that she was a criminal and should have been indicted. But knowing now what Comey knew then, it was reprehensible that he spilled the beans on one side and not on the other. There are a lot of other problems with him. Paying this rogue British agent, offering to pay him $50,000 a year to provide tapes of Donald Trump's behavior in a hotel room, then withdrawing the $50,000 offer, then announcing that it had been made and withdrawn, denying under oath that he knew about the surveillance of Trump pre-election when the whole intelligence community and much of law enforcement knew what was going on. These are very, very serious issues. Will we hear about this addressed in public? No.
Right.
Congress is going to reprimand him in private. The public has the right to know about this. And even we shouldn't have to rely on the New York Times to find out about it.
Right. And even with all that, the idea that changed the election would still be in dispute, I'm sure.
Well, she was a very, very flawed candidate, but I can understand her angst at the appearance of unfairness by discussing openly one investigation and remaining mute about the other.
Totally. I mean, we have to be consistent on what is right and just, and this did not appear to be right and just.
He should have been silent on both. And the evidence, I don't know what the evidence is in the Trump one because nothing's come out yet, but I've seen the evidence in her case.
Yeah.
Any prosecutor would have sought an indictment.
Judge Nap, you are the best. At Judge Nap, judgenap.com. We appreciate you. As always, have a rest of a week that is blessed, my friend.
God bless you.
Thank you. You too.